Before I begin this story, I want you to know that what I discovered will haunt me forever. If you're ready to dive into a family secret that goes deeper than murder, darker than betrayal, please hit that subscribe button, because this story has layers that will keep you questioning everything until the very last word. My Uncle David sat across from me at that mahogany table, tears streaming down his face, and said the words that shattered my entire world. I killed Rebecca Martinez 25 years ago. But Emma, your father didn't die of a heart attack. I killed him too. The lawyer's pen clattered to the floor. My mother's gasp echoed through the sterile conference room. And me. I just stared at this man I'd called Uncle Dave my entire life, this man who taught me to ride a bike, who never missed a birthday, who held my hand at my father's funeral, and realized I was sitting across from a monster. But let me start from the beginning, because this story, this nightmare, began long before that while reading, and the signs were there if only I'd been smart enough to see them. 3 months earlier, I was living my normal, boring 24-year-old life in Portland. Marketing job, tiny apartment, weekend brunches with friends who complained about their love lives while I complained about student loans. Then my phone rang at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and everything changed. "Emma, honey," my mother's voice was shaking. "Your father, he's gone. Heart attack," she said. Massive and sudden. Found him collapsed in his home office at 11 p.m. when she came down to tell him dinner was getting cold. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was over. I remember driving to the hospital thinking this couldn't be real. Dad was only 58. He jogged every morning, ate his vegetables, hadn't touched a cigarette since college. Sure, he'd been stressed lately, some issues at the construction company, financial pressures, but a heart attack? It seemed impossible. Uncle David was already at the hospital when I arrived, his arm around my sobbing mother. He looked devastated, genuinely heartbroken. He kept saying things like, "Tom was like a brother to me, and I can't believe he's gone, and if only I'd known he was struggling." The funeral was beautiful. Uncle David gave the eulogy and painted my father as a saint, devoted husband, loving father, pillar of the community. But there were moments during that speech when his voice would crack, when he'd pause and look directly at me with these haunted eyes. Like he was trying to tell me something he couldn't say out loud. "Your father was a man who carried heavy burdens," he said, his voice breaking. "Burdens that no one should have to carry alone. Tom was the kind of man who would sacrifice everything, even his own life, to protect the people he loved." At the time, I thought he was just being dramatic in his grief. Now I know he was confessing. In the weeks after the funeral, Uncle David became different. He'd always been close to our family, but suddenly he was at our house every single day. He'd bring groceries, help with paperwork, fix things around the house that didn't need fixing. My mother was grateful, but something about his constant presence felt wrong to me. The first red flag should have been the coffee. Every morning, without fail, Uncle David would show up at 7 a.m. with a fresh cup of Dad's favorite coffee from the local shop. "Tom always loved his morning routine," he'd say, placing it on the kitchen counter. "I want to keep that tradition alive for him." But here's the thing. My father had been dead for 2 weeks. Why was Uncle David still buying him coffee? When I asked, he stammered something about honoring Tom's memory and quickly changed the subject. But I noticed he always threw the untouched coffee away when he thought no one was looking. Then there were the phone calls. I'd catch him having hushed conversations in our backyard, always ending the call abruptly when someone approached. Once I heard him say, "I told you everything's handled. Tom took the secret to his grave." "Who was that?" I asked when he came back inside. "Work stuff," he said, but Uncle David had been retired for 3 years. But the really disturbing part was how he'd taken over Dad's entire routine. He'd sit in my father's chair, drink coffee from my father's favorite mug, even started wearing Dad's old flannel shirts that Mom had given him as keepsakes. It was like he was trying to become my father. And the questions. God, the constant questions. Did Tom seem worried about anything before he died? Did he mention any old friends lately? Any names from the past? Did he ever talk about mistakes he'd made? When I'd ask why he needed to know, he'd get this panicked look and say he was trying to understand what might have caused the stress that led to the heart attack. But the really weird thing was how he reacted whenever we talked about going through Dad's personal effects. Every time Mom mentioned cleaning out the home office or the basement, Uncle David would get this panicked look and volunteer to do it himself. "You two don't need that stress," he'd say. "Let me handle Tom's business papers and work files. Some of those construction deals were complicated. Better let me sort through the legal stuff." I started paying attention to details. Uncle David had lost at least 20 pounds in 3 weeks. I could see his wedding ring sliding around on his finger. He had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept since the funeral. His hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and he developed this nervous habit of checking his phone obsessively like he was expecting bad news. And sometimes, when he didn't know I was watching, I'd catch him staring at photos of my father with this expression that I couldn't identify at first. It wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was pure, gut-wrenching terror. One evening, I found him in our family room at 2 a.m., sitting in complete darkness, just staring at a framed photo of him and my father from last Christmas. When I turned on the light, he jumped like I'd fired a gun. "Uncle Dave, are you okay?" He looked at me with eyes that were completely haunted. "Emma, do you think your father knew he was going to die?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you think he had some kind of premonition? Like he was preparing for something?" The question sent chills down my spine. Why would you ask that? But he just shook his head and mumbled something about grief, making him think strange thoughts. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the funeral, I came home early from work and found Uncle David in my father's office. But this wasn't casual browsing. He was frantically tearing the place apart. Filing cabinets pulled open, papers scattered everywhere, books thrown on the floor. He had a crowbar and was prying open Dad's old desk drawers. When he saw me, he jumped like I'd caught him committing murder. Which, I now realize I basically had. "Oh, Emma, your mother asked me to look for the insurance papers. But Mom was at her book club. I just dropped her off. And the insurance papers were in the kitchen drawer where they'd been for months." "Uncle Dave," I said carefully, backing toward the door, "what are you really looking for?" The look he gave me was pure panic mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Rage. Desperation. He was holding that crowbar, and for just a split second, I saw something in his eyes that made me genuinely afraid. "Nothing," he said, but his voice was shaking. "Just trying to help your mother organize Tom's affairs." He gathered up the papers with hands that were trembling so badly he could barely hold them. As he pushed past me to leave, I smelled something on his breath that made my stomach turn. Not alcohol, something chemical, medicinal. "Uncle Dave, have you been taking medication? You smell like—" "Just some antacids," he said quickly. "Grief gives me heartburn." But I knew that smell from when my grandmother had heart problems. It was digitalis, heart medication. That night, I called my best friend Sarah and told her something was very wrong with Uncle David. "Maybe he's just grieving differently," she said. "Men sometimes don't process loss well." But I couldn't shake the feeling that Uncle David wasn't grieving. He was terrified, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized he wasn't afraid of losing my father. He was afraid of what my father had left behind. I started doing my own investigation. I began with my father's computer. He wasn't tech-savvy, so he never deleted his browser history or cleared his email. What I found made my blood run cold. In the weeks before his death, Dad had been researching private investigators. He'd visited websites about cold cases, missing persons, and something called posthumous justice. His search history included phrases like, "how to leave evidence after death," and "protecting family from dangerous person." But it was the emails that really scared me. My father's inbox was like a roadmap of his final weeks, and what I found there made my blood run cold. 3 weeks before his death, Dad had started corresponding with someone called Art.Martinez, advocate@gmail.com. The exchange was brief but terrifying. "Art.Martinez, advocate. Mr. Thompson, I received your message about my cousin Rebecca. Do you really have new information about her disappearance?" "Dad, yes. I have evidence that proves what happened to her. Evidence that implicates someone very close to my family." "Art.Martinez, advocate. Can you share this evidence with me?" "Dad, not over email. But I want you to know that if anything happens to me, I've left instructions for everything to be revealed. Rebecca deserves justice, even if it destroys my family." "Art.Martinez, advocate. Are you in danger, Mr. Thompson?" "Dad, I think my brother suspects I know the truth. I've been feeling sick lately, dizzy, chest pains. I think he might be trying to. I can't even write the words. R. Martinez, advocate, you need to go to the police immediately. Dad, I can't. Not yet. I need more proof. But if something happens to me, look for my daughter Emma. She has my eyes and my stubbornness. She'll finish what I started. The last email was sent just 2 days before Dad died. Dad, Maria, I don't have much time. David knows I've been investigating. He brought me coffee this morning and watched me drink every drop with a smile that made my skin crawl. I've hidden everything you need in a place he'll never think to look. If I don't contact you by Friday, it means he's killed me. Emma will find the truth. Emma will get justice for Rebecca. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands shaking. My father had known Uncle David was going to kill him. He'd been trying to protect himself, to gather evidence, to prepare for his own murder. And he'd failed. But more than that, Rebecca Martinez wasn't just a random missing person. She was someone Uncle David had killed, and my father had spent years investigating the murder. Rebecca, the same name that would later destroy my world in that lawyer's office. I needed to know more, but I was scared to investigate alone. What if Uncle David came back? What if he realized I was getting too close to whatever truth had gotten my father killed? But I couldn't let it go. That night, I waited until 3 a.m., then snuck into our basement with a flashlight. My father had spent hours down there over the years, claiming he was organizing tools or working on projects. But now I wondered if he'd been hiding something. The basement was full of the usual junk, holiday decorations, old furniture, boxes of documents from Dad's construction business. But there was one area that looked different. A workbench in the corner that was too clean, too organized. Everything else in the basement was covered in dust, but this workbench looked like it had been used recently. I started searching through the drawers. Construction blueprints, invoices, employee records. Nothing suspicious. But then I noticed something odd. One of the drawers was shorter than the others. Like it had a false bottom. I pried at the wood with a screwdriver until it popped loose. Underneath was a manila folder labeled Rebecca for Emma. Inside were copies of everything I'd found on the computer, plus more. Police reports showing that Rebecca Martinez had filed multiple complaints against David Thompson for stalking and harassment. Photos of bruises on her arms and neck. A restraining order request that had been denied due to insufficient evidence. But the officer's notes said complainant appears credible, but suspect has connections in department. There were financial records showing Uncle David had made large cash withdrawals right after Rebecca disappeared. Credit card receipts placing him at hardware stores buying lime, bleach, tarps, and shovels. Phone records proving he'd been calling Rebecca dozens of times a day in the weeks before she vanished. And then I found something that made me physically sick. A newspaper clipping from 1999 showing Rebecca's missing person photo. But someone had drawn X's over her eyes with red ink and written in the margin, "Problem solved. D." My uncle's handwriting. But the worst discovery was at the bottom of the folder. A cassette tape labeled, "Rebecca's Last Day, Hidden Camera Footage." I almost didn't want to watch it, but I had to know. I found an old cassette player in the garage and played the tape. The footage was grainy, clearly shot from a hidden camera, but I could make out 2 figures in what looked like an apartment living room. A young woman with dark hair, Rebecca, and a man I recognized immediately, Uncle David. On the tape, Rebecca was backing away from him, clearly terrified. "David, you need to leave. I have a restraining order." "That piece of paper doesn't mean anything," Uncle David replied, and his voice was completely different from the uncle I knew. Cold, menacing, dangerous. "You think you can just walk away from me? After everything we've been through? I don't want to see you anymore. What we had is over. Nothing is over until I say it's over." Rebecca grabbed a phone. "I'm calling the police." That's when Uncle David snapped. He lunged across the room and grabbed the phone, throwing it against the wall. Rebecca screamed and ran toward the door, but Uncle David caught her. What happened next? I can't describe it in detail. It was brutal, prolonged, and completely intentional. This wasn't a crime of passion or an accident. Uncle David tortured Rebecca Martinez for over an hour before he finally strangled her with his bare hands. The last thing on the tape was Uncle David talking to someone on his cell phone. "Tom, I need your help. Something terrible has happened." I was shaking when I turned off that tape. My father had seen this. My father had known exactly what kind of monster his brother was, and had spent 25 years gathering evidence to prove it. But I needed to understand how my father had died. The tape proved Uncle David was a killer, but I needed to know if he'd killed Dad too. I made an appointment with Dr. Harrison, our family doctor, but I didn't tell him why I really needed to see him. Instead, I said I was having panic attacks about Dad's sudden death and needed to understand what had happened medically. "Your father's death was very unexpected," Dr. Harrison said, reviewing the file. "The preliminary autopsy showed massive cardiac arrest, but what?" He looked uncomfortable, like he was debating whether to tell me something. Finally, he sighed. "Emma, your father came to see me multiple times in the weeks before he died. He was convinced someone was trying to poison him." The room started spinning. "What?" He said he'd been feeling dizzy, nauseous, having chest pains. He was convinced someone close to him was slowly poisoning him. I ran every test I could think of: blood work, toxicology, cardiac markers. Everything came back normal at the time, so I thought he was having anxiety attacks, maybe paranoia from stress. "Did he say who he thought was poisoning him?" Dr. Harrison hesitated for a long moment. He mentioned his brother. Said David had been bringing him coffee every morning for weeks, and that's when the symptoms started. "Your father was convinced David was putting something in his drinks." "What about the autopsy? Did they test for poison?" "With a clear cardiac arrest and no obvious signs of foul play, they did a standard autopsy." "But Emma," he leaned forward, "if someone used something like digitalis, a plant-based toxin that occurs naturally in heart medication, it would be nearly undetectable unless they specifically tested for it. And since your father had no history of heart problems, no one thought to look for it. Could someone get digitalis easily? If they had access to heart medication, yes. It's derived from foxglove plants, but it's also concentrated in prescription heart drugs. A small amount daily would cause gradual heart failure that looks completely natural." Dr. Harrison pulled out another file. "There's something else, Emma. Your father asked me to document everything about his symptoms. He said if anything happened to him, he wanted there to be a medical record of his suspicions." He handed me a thick folder. "These are copies of every visit, every test, every conversation we had. Your father was very specific. If he died suddenly, I was to give these records to you personally." Inside the folder was a detailed timeline of my father's final weeks. Progressive symptoms that perfectly matched digitalis poisoning. Notes about Uncle David's daily coffee deliveries. Even photographs my father had taken of his hands and face, showing subtle signs of toxin exposure. But the most damning evidence was a small vial at the bottom of the folder, labeled Coffee Sample, March 15, 2024. "Your father brought me this 2 days before he died," Dr. Harrison explained. He'd saved a sample of the coffee David had brought him. Asked me to have it tested, but said to wait until after he was gone to avoid tipping David off. "And I had it tested yesterday, after you called for this appointment. Emma, that coffee contained enough digitalis to kill a horse. My father had been murdered. Slowly, methodically, deliberately poisoned by the brother he loved and trusted his entire life. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Uncle David's behavior, my father's fears, and that mysterious Rebecca Martinez. I started putting together a timeline. 1999, Rebecca Martinez goes missing. 1999 to 2024, Uncle David lives a seemingly normal life, marries Carol, has kids. 2024, my father starts researching cold cases and private investigators. 2024, my father tells the doctor he thinks his brother is poisoning him. 2024, my father dies of a heart attack. 2024, Uncle David becomes obsessed with going through my father's personal effects. The pattern was clear. My father had discovered something about Rebecca Martinez, something that implicated Uncle David. Uncle David found out and killed my father to keep him quiet. But I needed proof, and I knew exactly where to look. The next night, I waited until Uncle David went home, then I used my key to get into my father's construction office. If Dad had been investigating Rebecca Martinez's disappearance, he would have kept evidence somewhere safe, somewhere Uncle David couldn't get to it. The office was exactly as Dad had left it. His coffee mug still on the desk, his reading glasses folded next to a stack of blueprints. But I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was there for answers. I searched everywhere. Filing cabinets, desk drawers, even inside old project binders. Nothing. Then I remember something Dad used to say. The best hiding place is in plain sight. I looked at his bookshelf. Dad wasn't much of a reader except for technical manuals and the occasional thriller. But there, between a book about concrete foundations and a guide to electrical wiring, was something that didn't belong. The complete works of Rebecca Martinez. It wasn't a real book. It was a hollow container, and inside were documents that made my hands shake as I read them. Police reports. Rebecca Martinez had filed multiple complaints against David Thompson, my uncle, for stalking, harassment, and assault. Photos of bruises on her arms and neck. A restraining order request that had been denied for insufficient evidence. And then, the smoking gun. A letter from Rebecca Martinez to my father, dated 2 days before she disappeared. Tom, thank you for believing me when no one else would. I know it's hard because David is your brother, but he's been escalating. He broke into my apartment last night and threatened to kill me if I didn't stop making trouble for him. I'm scared. The police won't help me because David knows people at the station. You're the only one who sees what he really is. I'm going to take your advice and leave town tomorrow night. I'll meet you at 8 p.m. at the warehouse on 5th Street, and you can drive me to the bus station like we planned. Once I'm safe, I'll call the police from Seattle and tell them everything. Thank you for being the brother David should have been. Rebecca. She never made it to Seattle. She never made it anywhere. But there was more. My father had been building a case for 25 years. Bank records showing unexplained cash withdrawals from Uncle David's account right after Rebecca disappeared. Credit card receipts placing Uncle David at a hardware store buying lime, bleach, and tarps. Testimony from Rebecca's friends saying she was planning to expose a connected man who had been abusing her. And finally, the most damning evidence of all, a confession letter in my father's handwriting, dated 1 week before his death. If anyone reads this, it means David has killed me to keep me quiet. 25 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. When Rebecca Martinez disappeared, I suspected my brother was involved, but I didn't have proof. David convinced me she had just left town like she planned. I wanted to believe him because he was my brother, but I never stopped investigating. Over the years, I gathered evidence that David murdered Rebecca Martinez in cold blood. When I finally confronted him with proof 3 weeks ago, he begged me to keep quiet. Said he would turn himself in after Carol died. She has cancer and doesn't have long. I agreed to wait, but David didn't trust me. He's been poisoning my morning coffee with Digitalis from Carol's heart medication. I can feel myself getting weaker every day. I'm not going to make it to see justice for Rebecca, but I've hidden evidence where David will never find it. Emma, if you're reading this, you're the only one I trust to finish what I started. David is a killer, and he killed me to protect himself. Don't let him get away with it again. I sat in that empty office, holding my father's final words, and wept. Not just for Rebecca Martinez, not just for my murdered father, but for the 25 years of lies that had poisoned our entire family. I could have gone to the police right then. Should have, probably. But I knew Uncle David would deny everything, claim the evidence was fabricated, get a good lawyer. He'd done it before with Rebecca, and he'd do it again. No, I needed a confession, and I knew exactly how to get it. I called Uncle David and told him I needed to see him urgently. I found something of Dad's, I said, my voice shaking just enough to sound believable. Something about Rebecca Martinez. I don't understand what it means, but I think Dad was in some kind of trouble. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted forever. Then, where did you find it? In his office. Uncle Dave, I'm scared. Can you come over and explain this to me? Another long pause. I'll be right there. I waited in my father's office with my phone recording everything. When Uncle David walked in, his face was gray with terror. He saw the documents spread out on the desk, the police reports, the photos, the letters. Emma, he said carefully, your father was obsessed with old cases. He thought he was some kind of detective. None of this means anything. Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost? His hands were shaking. Sweat dripped down his forehead. Your father, toward the end, He was paranoid. Delusional. He thought everyone was out to get him. Dad wasn't paranoid, Uncle Dave. He was right. That's when Uncle David broke down completely. You don't understand, he sobbed. I never meant for any of this to happen. She was going to destroy everything. My marriage, my kids, my whole life. So you killed her. It was an accident. We were arguing, and she fell and hit her head. I panicked. That's not what the police reports say. They say you've been stalking her for months, beating her, threatening to kill her. Uncle David looked at me with pure desperation. Your father, he was going to turn me in. After 25 years of keeping quiet, he suddenly grew a conscience. Said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. So you poisoned him. The admission came out as a whisper. Just a little digitalis in his coffee every morning. I thought if he had a heart attack, it would look natural. No one would investigate. But he figured it out. He was always too smart for his own good. Uncle David's voice was hollow. Even at the end, even when he was dying, he was still trying to protect you. He made me promise not to hurt you if he kept quiet about Rebecca. And you promised. I lied. Uncle David looked at me with dead eyes. Emma, you know too much now. Just like your father knew too much. That's when I realized my mistake. I was alone in an empty building with a man who had killed at least 2 people. And he was standing between me and the only exit. You're going to kill me too, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't want to, Uncle David said, but he was moving closer. You're like a daughter to me, Emma. But I can't go to prison. I can't lose everything I've built. What about Carol? What about your kids? They'll be better off thinking I died tragically than knowing I'm a murderer. I backed toward the window, my hand finding my phone. I'd been recording everything, but now I opened the live streaming app. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence. Uncle Dave, you don't have to do this. We can work something out. But his face had changed. The mask of the loving uncle had completely fallen away, and what was underneath was terrifying. This was the face Rebecca Martinez had seen before she died. This was the face my father had seen when he realized his own brother was poisoning him. I'm sorry, Emma, but you should have left well enough alone. He lunged toward me, but 25 years of guilt and recent weeks of stress had made him slow. I dodged and ran toward the door, screaming for help even though I knew the building was empty. But Uncle David had locked the door from the inside. I was trapped. That's when Uncle David started talking. Maybe it was the stress, maybe it was guilt, but suddenly he wanted to confess everything. He told me about the night he killed Rebecca, how it wasn't an accident like he'd claimed, but a rage-fueled attack when she threatened to expose his other crimes. Other crimes? I gasped. Rebecca wasn't the first, he said, his voice eerily calm now. There was a girl in college, Sarah Kim. Everyone thought she committed suicide, threw herself off the dorm roof. But I pushed her because she was going to report me for rape. My blood turned to ice. And there were others over the years. Women who got too close to the truth. Your father only knew about Rebecca, but there were 4 others. He was a serial killer. My Uncle David, who had bounced me on his knee as a child, was a serial killer. The only person who ever came close to figuring it out was your father, Uncle David continued. Tom was always too observant, too moral. He spent 25 years investigating Rebecca's disappearance in his spare time. He was building a case against me piece by piece. Why didn't he turn you in sooner? Because he loved me. Because I was his big brother, and he couldn't accept what I really was. Until 3 weeks ago, when he finally found proof I couldn't explain away. Uncle David pulled a knife from his jacket. I kept this from Rebecca. A little memento. But as he raised the knife, something unexpected happened. The door burst open, and police officers flooded into the room. My live stream had been broadcasting everything, and someone had called 911. Uncle David was tackled and arrested on the spot, still clutching Rebecca's bloodstained knife. Later, I learned that my father had done more than just gather evidence. He'd been in contact with a private investigator named Maria Santos, the real person behind the R. Martinez advocate email address. She was Rebecca's cousin, and she'd been investigating the disappearance for years. My father had arranged for all his evidence to be delivered to the police and the FBI if anything happened to him. The will reading was just his way of making sure I knew the truth before Uncle David was arrested. But there was one more twist. The safety deposit box my father had mentioned in his letter, it contained evidence not just about Rebecca Martinez, but about all 5 of Uncle David's victims. My father had been investigating his brother's entire criminal history. Sarah Kim, the college student. Jennifer Walsh, a coworker who had discovered Uncle David embezzling money. Lisa Rodriguez, a neighbor who had seen him dumping something suspicious in the woods. Angela Turner, a bank teller who had noticed irregularities in his accounts. All ruled as accidents or suicides. All actually murdered by the man I'd called Uncle for 24 years. Uncle David's trial was a media sensation. The family monster, they called him. The uncle who killed for secrets. The evidence my father had gathered over 25 years was overwhelming. DNA evidence on Rebecca's knife. Financial records showing suspicious activity around each disappearance. Testimony from surviving friends and family members who remembered Uncle David's inappropriate behavior toward the victims. And my recording from that night in the office, where he had confessed to everything. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 5 counts of first-degree murder. Carol divorced him immediately and changed her name. Their children, my cousins, refused to visit him in prison. The family name we'd shared was permanently tainted. But the most haunting part was what came out during the psychological evaluation. Uncle David showed no remorse, no empathy. When asked why he'd killed those women, he said, "They were going to inconvenience me." 5 women died because they were going to inconvenience him. 6 months after the trial, I organized a memorial service for all 5 victims. Rebecca Martinez, Sarah Kim, Jennifer Walsh, Lisa Rodriguez, and Angela Turner. 5 women whose deaths had been covered up for decades by a monster who shared my DNA. Their families came. Mothers who had spent years wondering what happened to their daughters. Sisters who had blamed themselves for not protecting their siblings. Friends who had suspected foul play but couldn't prove it. And they all thanked my father. Even in death, even 25 years later, Tom Thompson had finally given them the justice they deserved. I spoke at the memorial about my father's courage in exposing the truth, even when it meant revealing that his own brother was a killer. About how love sometimes means doing the hardest thing possible, holding the people we care about accountable for their crimes. Rebecca's mother, now in her 70s, hugged me afterward. "Your father was the only person who believed my daughter when she said someone was trying to hurt her," she whispered. "He saved her memory, even if he couldn't save her life." People ask me how I'm doing now, living with the knowledge that my uncle is a serial killer and my father died trying to expose him. The truth is, some days are harder than others. I think about those family gatherings where Uncle David would tell jokes and play with the kids, all while hiding the fact that he was a murderer. I think about my father, carrying the weight of his suspicions for 25 years, dying before he could see justice done. But I also think about Rebecca Martinez, finally at peace. About Sarah Kim's family, finally having answers. About the 4 other women whose stories can now be told. My father's last act was an act of love, not just for our family, but for the victims who had been silenced. He made sure the truth would come out, even if he couldn't be there to see it. There's one last thing I haven't told you. Something I discovered just last month, going through the final box of my father's belongings. A letter addressed to me, written the day before he died. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then David has killed me and you've discovered the truth about what our family has been hiding. I'm sorry you have to carry this burden, but you're the strongest person I know. There's something else you need to know. David didn't just kill those 5 women. He killed our father too. Your grandfather's hunting accident when you were 5? David shot him because Dad had discovered David's relationship with Rebecca and was threatening to intervene. I never had proof, but I always suspected. David has been killing people who threatened to expose him for 30 years. I was just the latest in a long line of family members who got too close to the truth. But you, my darling daughter, you have something David doesn't. You have courage, you have integrity, and you have the intelligence to make sure this stops with him. Make sure his story gets told. Make sure people know what he really was. Make sure no other family has to go through what we've endured. I love you more than words can express, and I'm proud of the woman you've become. Dad, so now you know the full truth. My Uncle David didn't just kill 5 women and my father. He killed my grandfather too. 7 murders over 30 years, all to protect his secrets. But his secrets are buried with him now, metaphorically speaking. He'll die in prison, forgotten and reviled. And the women he killed will be remembered as the victims they were, not the inconveniences he saw them as. I quit my marketing job 6 months ago and started working as a victim's advocate. I help families of missing persons, families who suspect their loved ones were murdered but can't prove it, families like mine, living with terrible suspicions and no answers. I think my father would be proud. Every time I help a family find the truth, every time I give voice to someone who can no longer speak for themselves, I think about that while reading. About Uncle David's shocked face when he realized he couldn't hide anymore. About my father's final gift, the courage to seek justice, no matter how painful the truth might be. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the secrets that families hide and the courage it takes to expose them, please share it. And if you know someone who might be in danger from someone they trust, please don't stay silent. Sometimes the people who seem the most normal, the most loving, the most trustworthy, are hiding the darkest secrets of all. Remember Rebecca Martinez. Remember Sarah Kim, Jennifer Walsh, Lisa Rodriguez, and Angela Turner. Remember that their lives mattered, their stories deserve to be told, and their families deserve the truth. And remember my father, Tom Thompson, who spent 25 years building a case for justice, even when it meant exposing the monster in his own family. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when we try to bury it. The question is, will you be brave enough to help it along? Thank you for staying with me through this nightmare. If you have thoughts about family secrets, justice, or the courage it takes to expose the truth, please leave them in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear the story, someone who might be living with dangerous secrets, please share this with them. Sometimes, the most important thing we can do is refuse to stay silent.